Huangci, and welcome to Henley Video Tutorials. Today we're going to talk about Mozart's Piano Concerto in A major, K488. One doesn't have to speak so much about it because we all know and love it. It's one of his best-known works and also one of the best-known piano concertos, one of my personal favorites. So I'm very much looking forward to working with you on it. Without further ado, let's get started. In the first movement, there are actually two challenges which I want to highlight from the very beginning. And these are also challenges which then can be applied in the later movements. So the first is there are several places in this concerto where notes are limited and we still have to create a very long picture. We have to make a long phrase. And in order to do that, I like to subdivide a lot of these sections into 4-bar phrases, 8-bar phrases, 16-bar phrases. The longer the phrase, the better it is to always come up with a big picture. And the second challenge is Mozart is always known for having a lot of scales or a lot of arpeggios, and it can turn out that they sound a little bit too studied, almost like a practice piece. And that's something we need to avoid at all costs. And in order to counteract that, I like to do what I call microdynamics or dynamic layering, and we're going to get into that closer as we go into the piece. So let's start with the theme of the piano. One thing about this whole tutti is that the orchestra actually introduces the first subject as well as the second subject, and it definitely does us good to listen and maybe later imitate the phrasing or the articulation from them. When we start in bar 67, I can see right away that the left hand in this whole piece is much more than accompaniment. There are so many lines, inner lines, which then can be used, such as I'm exaggerating, of course, but such a line. It makes the whole theme sound a lot thicker, a lot richer in color. And what we just played, that is a 4-bar. We can already divide the whole piano first entry from bar 67 until bar 82 as a 16-bar phrase, and to think of it in at least 4 bars. Note that I actually use the left hand for the inner voice in bar 69. And going on. And the phrase is not over. So you see it's already a very long phrase, and this is just a step to see how we can try to make as big of a phrase as possible. Some of the scales starting in bar 79, this is exactly what I mean by a scale having the tendency to sound studied or too perfectly executed, so to say. So the dynamics have to sound extremely natural. So when it goes down, I do a decrescendo, and when it goes back up, I do a crescendo, and then I would actually lead into the orchestra with a crescendo rather than ending it on my own. Many times we should always end our phrases bearing in mind how the orchestra sounds. Starting in bar 86, we can talk a little bit about microdynamics and about dynamic layering, because this is a section where there's many scales which is being repeated almost. So I see it as a very long decrescendo. But within this 4 bars, every single bar I do a little hairpin, which is what I refer to as a little mini crescendo and a mini decrescendo coming down, and that gives the whole phrase a little bit more life and a little bit more inner line. And from bar 91, this is again an example of where the left hand in bar 97, for me, from personal experience, there could be a tendency not to be exactly together with the orchestra because the piano is playing a downward scale and the orchestra has So pay special attention not to rush and to be aware of when the orchestra is playing with the piano. Now, in the second subject of this movement, I think it shows the whole atmosphere, the mood of the movement, which is not completely happy. I find there is something melancholy, there's something sad about it, almost with the idea of smiling through tears, and that's really well heard in the second theme. I'll play it slowly so you can see the fingering, but the most important thing to remember is that even with the repeated notes, it's still a melody and it's leading each time to the new harmony. In this concerto, there are several moments where the orchestra and piano have a lively dialogue. And an example of this is bar 120, where a melodic fragment is repeated a couple times, and there has to be some kind of development or some kind of difference between the repeats. So in this place where the little fragment is repeated 3 times, orchestra and piano, I would play the first time strongly, second time very quiet, and third kind of crescendo. And when this is well coordinated with the orchestra and they follow this dynamic plan, the whole piece can sound extremely organic. From bar 127, this is another place where dynamic layering is important so that it doesn't sound too studied. And bar 131, the dynamic layering can actually be per quarter. There could be little hairpins on each of these quarters. In bar 158, it's a little bit tricky to plan the entrance of the piano to come in exactly on time, not too early or not too late. And the hard thing is because we don't play the downbeat. And so we're relying on our instincts. How did I practice this? I actually played a couple times the downbeat with my left hand. So playing from the orchestra tutti at bar 156. So it's very easy if we were to play the downbeat. So after a couple times of practicing like that, I started actually giving the impulse of the downbeat with my left hand, one of the fingers, perhaps on the leg or so. And you can practice this very slowly. In the end, it should be just part of your system, and you could actually even self-conduct and give yourself a cue mid-air. From bar 170, this is another very long phrase where there's a lot of runs, a lot of 16th notes, where one has to come up with a dynamic plan. And I would try to find the harmony which needs the most emphasis, which has the most harmonic tension, and emphasize that. So personally, I would try to show the A minor section as being the deepest part in this part. From bar 189, we enter a kind of improvisatory phase of this movement. Mozart was, of course, very well known for composing beautiful operas, beautiful arias, and a lot of singing, but he was also known for having a lot of places where it's a recitative. And so it's up to us to be fully spontaneous and to almost feel like we're reciting a poem in a way. And the whole area from bar 189 to 198 should be in this kind of mood. And that leads us very smoothly into the cadenza, which is also in a very free form. All the harmonies here, we should try to show different colors. So there's the A major, very joyous, and by the time we get to bar 6 of the cadenza, there has to be something mysterious. Each of these represent a different color. All the arpeggios starting from bar 15, it's not just arpeggio, they're not just virtuosic outbursts, rather they are expanded melodies, or let's say fragments which are supposed to be operatic in nature. From bar 26, I will play slowly. So you see the fingering of the left hand. There's often a danger when you're playing very fast to kind of forget. There we have the first movement of this Mozart concerto. And now we're continuing with Mozart's second movement from his Piano Concerto number 23, K488. This melody is very unusual for me because it's very difficult to sing, which is strange. Most of his melodies are very singable, but it's because there's such a big distance between the notes in the melody. And what happens between the notes, that creates great tension. So this leads us into the mood of the piece. The mood of this movement, I think, is one of the deepest kind of tragedy, of deepest sorrow. There's almost a spiritual aspect to it. And a lot can be done just working with the different harmonies that we have, trying to find the inner voices of the left hand, and actually showing the tension by not relaxing our fingers between each of the notes. So that is a 4-bar phrase, and again, we're subdividing it just like in the rest of the piece, actually. So I see the piano solo part as having 4-bar phrase followed by an 8-bar phrase. And when I say showing the inner voices of the left hand, for example, it adds a lot more tension. Going on from bar 5, the upcoming 2-note slurs, I don't think of one note as being less than the other, but rather them to having the same kind of equal touch and almost going into this harmony in the middle of bar 7. And it's very important for us to show all of these very unusual harmonic progressions. There's so many surprises. Now, bar 10, it's almost floating in the air, and we have to find a fingering which would show that the best. Some people can do this, the normal arpeggio fingering, or you can use the same finger and almost slide off of the key in a kind of diminuendo motion. And very important here is that we're not finishing the phrase. This is not the end. Rather, we're setting up the orchestra, and the orchestra is continuing what we have to say in the same kind of mood. It's always very important to look at what Mozart orchestrates after we finish a phrase. In the second entry of this movement, we can still do a lot of the same things, the same 2-note slurs and tension, showing again the harmonic surprises, for example, the transition from bar 24 to 25. Giving the people something to be shocked about. In bar 30 to 31, there's a huge span, a 2-note span, and this is what I mean by great distances having more tension, because this is the climax of this section. Obviously, it's not possible to connect this with our fingers without the help of the pedal, but we should still try to have a horizontal movement rather than a jumping vertical movement when we play this part. When I play this piece from bar 35, I like to have the music, the major part of this movement, to have a little bit more momentum. And if that suits your personal taste, it would make sense to prepare the orchestra and the conductor a little bit from bar 34, the middle. And that will lead us very smoothly into the next set transition. Mozart has a lot of dialogue, a lot of interplay with the orchestra. In this concerto, there's a lot of chamber music effects. And a lot of these transitions then also go from the piano being an accompaniment to the piano being the main melody. And these transitions are very important acoustically to be clear. For example, from bar 44 to 45, we have to go from a filigree scale into melody. So it makes sense to prepare it a little bit before the melody starts. Almost having a little crescendo into the melody. The second time the theme comes in the piano, it's almost note for note exactly the same. Yet I feel it should have a slightly different character because we're hearing it now also differently after all that's happened before. I would play it the second time with more space between the notes, a bit more secretive maybe in character, even darker in character. We have to remember that he repeated this for a reason. From bar 76, I feel like then we've reached the heart of the movement. There's such pain here. And the two hands have to be very organic in sound. The left hand is not just accompaniment, it really adds the character. From bar 80, the left hand enters a very strong dialogue with the bassoon in an orchestra. So don't be too shy and really bring that out, while again showing the tension points in the right hand and the distance between the notes. From bar 84, the orchestra does something really mysterious sounding, but it's up to the piano to really hold the tension. And these are moments, again, where we can't possibly play legato without the pedal, but we have to really feel the space and we have to try. I'd also like to mention in bars 95 and 96, there are the notes being played in the left hand, the B and the B sharp. We should really emphasize these because they show a very special harmonic progression. So I'll play a little bit from bar 94, the orchestra part. And there we have the second movement of Mozart's Concerto. And now we're on the third movement of Mozart's Piano Concerto number 23, K488. After the first and second movement, for the first time, we feel complete joy. And this movement is exuding that from the very beginning. I think the most important tip I would have is to prepare for the right tempo. There's a very big danger of starting too fast, and this is a movement where it can get very quickly out of control. So it would make sense to give yourself, or almost self-conducting your mind, 2 bars before actually starting to make sure that you are at a comfortable tempo. One thing I would also do in the second bar is to give myself this impulse on the second beat. This is all, first of all, to ensure that one doesn't rush, and also to give yourself another reason to be very stable. And you can do that by giving an audible breath, or at least by feeling this beat with the rest of your body. And that can be repeated throughout the rest of the movement. A lot of what we talked about in the first and second movement can be also applied here in the third, such as with dynamic layering. Starting from bar 91, there's a lot of things we can do. There can be 4 or 6 bars, actually, of diminuendo, and then another 6 bars of crescendo, but always with microdynamics in the middle. In bar 113, we can apply the same trick from the first movement, where since we're not playing the downbeat in the piano, we could give ourselves an invisible kind of conducting to make sure that it's a seamless interaction coming out from the orchestra. From bar 129, I always wondered what's the best way to practice this place, because it's definitely very tricky. And I think the biggest danger is for the left hand to move too much towards the middle of the bar, and therefore to be a little bit rushy. Like, it's very easy to clump the arpeggiation together, but of course it needs to be completely, which is difficult because we're not really playing the first note. So to practice that, I would start by eliminating maybe the 8th note in the right hand. A couple times until you have the feeling in your hands, and then to slowly add the 8th. I think the dangerous thing is actually when the right hand has some tension, when it's stretching for a chord. Then the left hand also, it translates into the left hand, the tension. So the most important thing is to keep the left hand very loose and the right hand to be as loose as possible. And continuing with dynamic layering from there. From bar 151, I will play slowly so you can see my fingering. On each of these arpeggios, I start with the thumb in the right hand so as not to change my hand position from a straight position into a kind of curved position. Like in the rest of the concerto, there's a lot of dialogue between the piano and the orchestra. And another special place is from bar 193 until the repeat of the theme in bar 202. And this is a place, again, where you can coordinate together with the orchestra in a kind of dynamic plan. So you could start very soft and then strong, or vice versa. And then when you start bar 197, it's a very long crescendo. So you make the crescendo together with the woodwinds. In bar 230 here, in the development of this movement, I again incorporate this physical breathing so as not to rush in the scale coming downward after the chord. Now, the 2 bars from 236, and then later the 2 bars from 252, they have 2 very different harmonic progressions. So I would show something different. The first time could be a decrescendo. And the second, more intense harmonies, could be a crescendo. From the section bar 262, there's a lot of dialogue, there's a lot of transitions from the piano being accompaniment to the piano having the melody. You could change this not only in the dynamic level, the melody being more cantabile, but also changing the articulation a little bit so that when the piano is playing the accompaniment, to be a little bit crispier in sound, a little bit more detached, not so legato. I'll play it from bar 270.
differences in the articulation there.
In bar 307, we have a kind of tricky place again to be completely together with the orchestra. It's very easy for us to lose orientation when we're playing a sequence going up in a pattern. We might lose exactly where the downbeat is in each bar. And this is not to say that there should be an accent, but rather just to be mentally aware of where the downbeat is and maybe to give a little impulse in the first beat of bar 307. To feel that exactly and to make it clear to the orchestra as well for them to come in securely. From bar 464, I'll play slowly so you can see my fingering. And let's not always forget the place for our left hand to imitate the bassoon, the very famous bassoon part. This piece is a lot of fun with huge interaction with the orchestra and with the conductor. And there's a lot of ways for us to experiment with interpretation. And it also shows such a wide variety of emotions. So I wish you a lot of fun in learning it and later performing it for your audiences.